I call the honourable member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's with pleasure I join the debate on the Excise Tariff Amendment 2009. And on April 26th of last year, the government gazetted increases to the rate of excise and excise equivalent customs duty applying on such beverages from $39.36 to $66.67 per litre of alcohol content. And it's worth noting the Australian Taxation Office and Australian Customs Service have been collecting the excise and excise equivalent customs duty at the higher rate since 27th of April 2008. And I note from the Minister's second reading speech and a comment she made that no one who reads the newspaper or watches television can be unaware of the problems caused by binge drinking. Community leaders, police and health experts alike agree that action needs to be taken. And I do say so from the outset, Deputy Speaker, that I believe the Minister is well intended in her attempts to address the plague of binge drinking and the associated violence which goes with it. And I say that most genuinely. I believe the Minister is very concerned by the escalation in violence we've seen in our streets, and a lot of it has been related to the overindulging alcohol. And what I do say, though, that the stated objective of this legislation to reduce the incidence of binge drinking and the associated violence, although well intended, has been misguided, because even as the previous speaker has just indicated, he claimed that the strategy is working because sales of ready-to-drink alcohol products have dropped. But it is a flawed argument, Deputy Speaker, when this was meant to actually curb binge drinking, and not one shred of evidence has been presented that in the period of the last 10 months that there's been any success at all in relation to this strategy in terms of reducing the incidence of binge drinking in our community. The success of this strategy should be measured in terms of less violence on our streets, or less hospitalisation of drunks, or of less binge drinking amongst young people, not in purely whether the sales of ready-to-drink products have dropped. And as I'll be making my point further on, Deputy Speaker, I believe a lot of the problem is the people involved in excessive drinking of alcohol is more of a cultural issue, and they are simply substituting one product for another and continuing to overindulge. And the increase in the Alcopops tax is really just a tax grab masquerading as a health initiative, because unfortunately we have not seen any evidence to suggest that the Alcopops tax has resulted in improved social behaviour, particularly in relation to young people and the incidence of binge drinking. There hasn't been a shred of evidence to suggest that this has actually occurred, and people are still getting drunk, they're still causing the same level of mayhem in our community, and they're unfortunately using different forms of alcohol, or even worse, Deputy Speaker, I fear many resorting to illicit drugs, in particular amphetamines. There were doubts expressed from day one that this excise increase would actually work, and the government, as I said, has no proof thus far that it has been effective. The Minister, in introducing this legislation, has attempted to address what I think everyone on all sides of Parliament, all sides of this House, would agree is a particularly important issue in our community. But it is an issue which is very difficult to address, and it's not going to be resolved by simply increasing the tax on one product. I fear that there is a culture perhaps deeply embedded in the Australian society, and it's on no wowser by any stretch of the imagination, Deputy Speaker. I enjoy a drink. In fact, there are occasions where I enjoy several drinks. Some of them are in fact ready-to-drink products, and otherwise it might be sampling the red wine or beer. But I think I'm fairly typical of a lot of other people in our community that the imposition of a tax on one particular form of alcohol while increasing the cost will then just result in a substitution. I've seen it amongst many of my colleagues, friends and family members, in fact, that instead of reducing their alcohol consumption, they've simply just substituted from one form to another. But it is a cultural issue in Australia, and I think one of the areas that the government and our society needs to tackle with far more enthusiasm is the whole issue of the leadership provided by our role models in the community. If we are serious about addressing this culture of binge drinking, we've got to start addressing it at a much more public level. And I refer particularly to some of the buffoons, if you like, you see on our various football shows in Victoria. It's the Australian Rules Footy Show, and in New South Wales, Queensland, the Rugby League Football Show. And I've seen many occasions where public drunkenness is actually celebrated on these shows. I've seen reporters associated with those shows attending awards nights. The reporters themselves are intoxicated, and they think it's a heck of a joke to be interviewing someone else who's suitably inebriated. And I think if we're going to be serious about addressing the issue of binge drinking, we're going to need to start tackling these issues in a far more aggressive manner, and making it very clear that there's a standard of behaviour we expect from our community leaders, and our sports people are among those. And we need to be leading from example, not just at that level, but also on the home front. So these are far more difficult issues than simply increasing a tax. No one's prepared to talk in any great detail about the example we set ourselves in our own homes. A lot of the attitude children develop towards alcohol is on the home front, and if we're continually relying on alcohol as parents to have a good time, it certainly reflects to our children. I think these are some of the more difficult issues the government is going to need to be at least discussing and considering in its approach to binge drinking, way beyond simply addressing the whole issue of the Alcopops tax. Deputy Speaker, one of the areas that concerns me greatly in regional communities is that we're not offering our young people enough alternatives to attend functions or be involved in community activities which don't involve alcohol. We have a cohort of people in our community, probably about 13 to 18-year-olds, who are faced with a situation, particularly in many regional communities, where there's very little options of entertainment or activities which don't involve some level of alcohol. Most community groups and sporting organisations are in a situation where they actually rely on alcohol sales to fund their organisations. So we have on the one hand a government, and not just this government, many governments refusing to fund these sporting organisations to the full extent of what's required for them to improve their facilities and to run their organisations, but on the other hand telling them they must be involved in the responsible service of alcohol. Well, it's actually a catch-22 for the sporting clubs. They need to make a quid, and they choose to make it at the bar because that's the most likely place they're going to make it. And then, on the other hand, the government is suggesting that they're doing something wrong, but not prepared to come to the party and actually help fund their activities. It's a state and federal government issue, and it's something that's going to require a more coordinated effort in the months and years ahead. It's inevitable that these sporting clubs, whether they be football clubs or cricket clubs or surf lifesaving clubs, will encourage greater alcohol sales because it's in their interest to maintain their club's activities. My other concern with the Alcopops, Deputy Speaker, as I referred to earlier, is particularly an issue of substitution. Once this legislation was announced, the first feedback I received was right in the middle of the Gippsland by-election campaign. The first feedback I received in one of the shopping centres in one of my towns was from a mother who came up to me and said she caught her son and 3 of his mates the other week at a party. They were taking mouthfuls out of a bottle of bourbon and then gobbling down a bit of Coke with it, and said they were mixing their own drinks. Now, it may be a funny story, but really on reflection it just indicates these particular young people had just substituted their previous product they used to buy, a bourbon and Coke type drink, and were then mixing their own drinks in their mouth, would you believe. So some of these young men, they were only young 17, 18-year-old teenagers, pretty unsophisticated in terms of their knowledge of alcohol and what they were doing, and certainly there was no measured shot of alcohol involved. And it concerns me that what we've seen is simply a replacement. There are people who, in our community, unfortunately, there's a culture of binge drinking to harmful levels, and it is actually their deliberate intent at the start of a night or whatever it might be, at the start of a party or an occasion, it is their deliberate intent to get themselves wasted. This is not about which type of alcohol they prefer. They'll find the cheapest type of alcohol they can get and they'll simply substitute it. So I believe that while the Minister's attempts to address binge drinking are certainly well intended, I don't believe that in reality out there in the community this is actually having any result at all, and simply there has not been any shred of evidence presented to the House in the subsequent 10 months that actually there's been any reduction in the level of violence or in the incidence of binge drinking in our community. So I think if we're not prepared to accept the fact that there is a culture out there of people who will just simply substitute whatever product they get their hands on, the cheaper the better, then we are really missing the point in terms of trying to address this issue at its root cause. I think targeting the ready-to-drink products alone has been particularly unscientific in that regard, and I don't believe it's going to achieve the stated health aims. I think the common sense within the community tells me that people simply will substitute one brand of alcohol for another. And I quote the example of a club in New South Wales which I attended prior to the Christmas break, and you'd go to the bar of a particular club on the south coast of New South Wales and a bourbon and Coke in a bottle was $9. Well, that would be about 3 pots or middies, whatever I'm not sure what you call them in New South Wales. So people were simply not buying that particular product and just transferring their choice of alcohol to something else, and they'll The concern for me is that by pricing these particular products at exorbitant levels, and I don't have any evidence to support my concern, but I have a concern that pricing these products at this sort of level ends up in encouraging young people to experiment with illicit drugs. I know I'd much prefer my children, when they get to the age of consuming alcohol, or get to a legal age, to actually consume alcohol which is produced within strict health guidelines, in comparison to sampling amphetamines which are cooked up in some criminal's kitchen or other establishment. And I think it's a real issue for us by pricing these products, these ready-to-drink products, to such a level that they make it more attractive for people to be purchasing ecstasy and other types of amphetamines. And Deputy Speaker, the Shadow spokesman, when he spoke earlier this morning, clearly highlighted the opposition's position on this legislation was based on the fact that simply it was bad policy. It is irresponsible of those opposite to suggest that they somehow have a mortgage on the empathy with our community or concern with our community in relation to the issue of overindulging in alcohol and the associated violence. Now, it reflects poorly, I believe, on this chamber if we're always slinging arrows back and forward at each other, when I do believe that there is genuine goodwill on both sides of the House in relation to trying to curb the incidence of binge drinking and the associated violence that goes with it. If this was a genuine health measure, and I take up the point from the opposition health spokesman, if this was a genuine health measure, why did it emanate from the finance ministries in the first place and not the health department? I fear this is more about being a tax grab than anything to do with actually improving the health outcomes. And just in terms of feedback, we've talked about research at different times during this debate. Today, in the Fin Review, the Access Economics Commission, and I acknowledge this Access Economics research was commissioned by the Distilled Spirits Industry Council of Australia, and it showed there had been little or no change in the impact of high-risk drinking by young people since the introduction of the increased tax on ready-to-drink products. And there's a quote here from Access Economics Director and Health Economist Lynn Pizzello, who says, "If anything, hospitalisation rates of young people due to acute intoxication and harmful use of alcohol worsened in the months following the government's tax increase." Now, I don't make that point with any great relish, because it's basically saying that our incidence of alcohol abuse and associated violence and young people placing themselves in harm's way has actually increased over the past 10 months. There's no joy in quoting those figures or quoting that information from Access Economics, but it simply proves the point that this is going to be a lot harder of a dragon to slay than simply by increasing a tax. And Ms Pizzello also said the analysis had showed that young people who moved away from the pre-mixed drinks such as vodka and lemonade or rum and coke to other alcohol could end up buying more standard drinks for $20 than before they switched. And that is my genuine fear, Deputy Speaker, that we are simply going to get in a position where young people will substitute their products and will still go on their merry way with overindulging in alcoholic products. There's a question being raised, of course, in this whole debate is if the bill is defeated, what happens to the money raised? And I believe the hundreds of millions of dollars, I believe it's in the vicinity of more than 220, perhaps up to $345 million have been raised from this tax grab in the past 10 months. I believe they should be directed to some real programs to curb the binge drinking problems. I hope the money is, if the bill is defeated, that money can be directly hypothecated back to anti-binge drinking initiatives. And it's more than just advertising programs, although I do freely acknowledge that that is a good start. I believe in the Minister's own contribution to the debate, she referred to the National Binge Drinking Strategy, and the strategy includes $53.5 million. 14.4 of that is for community-level initiatives, which I referred to before in terms of the culture of binge drinking. $19.1 million to intervene earlier to assist young people to ensure they assume personal responsibility for their binge drinking, and a $20 million advertising campaign. Now, each of those in their own right has a great deal of merit, but it's only $53.5 million. We've already supposedly raised in excess of $200 million over the past 10 months from this tax grab. Now, one of the things I would like to refer to again, and it relates to the National Binge Drinking Strategy, referring to the $14.4 million to invest in community-level initiatives, and it does highlight the need for sporting codes to be involved. We have this situation in regional areas, and I assume it pretty much occurs in suburban areas as well, where young men and women are interacting with adults from a very, very early age. We have a smaller population base. We need our teenage boys, for example, playing in senior footy teams. We have young girls playing in adult netball teams. And again, they are exposed to the culture of our sporting clubs. It can be football, cricket, netball, tennis, the lawn bowls even, where, again, alcohol is playing a very important part of the whole culture of the club. And I believe that supporting young people through that early interaction with adults and giving them an understanding that you can responsibly enjoy alcohol is something that we should be aspiring to. And I don't believe that we're doing anywhere near enough in that particular area. I accept the National Binge Drinking Strategy is doing some work with our sporting clubs, but I believe we have such a long way to go in that regard, particularly in regional areas where it's such a focus of community activity, and we have a real opportunity to show our young people how they can enjoy themselves in that environment without overindulging. In the time that has left to me, Deputy Speaker, I'd like to refer to the I believe what is a misunderstanding of what's actually happening out there in the community in terms of the actual impact of this type of tax. I think the government is basically failing to understand the mentality of some of these binge drinkers. We all acknowledge there is potential for self-harm and the incidence of violence associated with overindulging alcohol, but I think simply increasing the tax on one product is not going to ever address the bigger issues that I've already referred to. It's not going to be easy, and I don't envy the Minister her task in this regard. But we don't have, and I don't pretend either to have solutions at my fingertips. But I think simply increasing that tax and declaring a war on binge drinking is not going to be the answer. I'm very keen to work with the government in good faith to help reduce the incidence of binge drinking in our community and the violence which is associated with it. It's going to take a lot more than a tax grab, and it's going to take a lot more than simply nice words about declaring war to gain a media headline. This is a war that's going to need to be won at a very much at a grassroots level, house by house and street by street, town by town and city by city. People are concerned, and across all spectrums of political life, people are concerned, our communities are concerned about the incidence of binge drinking, and they are concerned about the level of associated violence. And we all accept that action is needed, but there is a genuine doubt and concerns on my side of the House that the Alcopops tax is not the silver bullet which is being presented to us. It's going to take a lot more than just simply a tax hike on one alcohol product. The action is going to be needed in terms of the advertising and education, which I understand is underway. We're going to need to be leading by example in our homes as responsible adults. We need to be demanding better standards from our television shows and from our sporting stars and celebrities. And we need to be funding programs to rehabilitate those and to help those with a drinking problem. And we also need to be supporting those community and sporting clubs I referred to earlier. And I'll give you a classic example in a small country town where I live in Lakes Entrance. We organise an annual New Year's Eve fireworks display. And New Year's Eve in coastal towns in Victoria has been synonymous as a fight night in the past. It's been a night where people have wandered the streets, getting drunk, causing trouble, and then waiting for the fireworks at midnight. That has been the typical experience of some of the coastal towns in Victoria. And about 8 years ago, I was involved with my local Business and Tourism Association. We made the decision that we were trying to reclaim New Year's Eve as a family night, so we decided we'd run an alcohol-free event. We'd have a family fireworks display at 9:30 and another fireworks display at midnight. I think it's actually one of the first times this was done in Australia, to have a 9:30 fireworks display to encourage family groups back to the foreshore to enjoy what should have been a night of family entertainment. And by making that evening alcohol-free, we hope to encourage more family groups to get involved. Now, the point I'd like to make, Deputy Speaker, is that in organising that event, we were very successful. We were very successful. The police supported us, our local business community supported us, our local council supported us, and we've been running that event for the last 7 years. The rate of arrests in our community has plummeted. I think the last 2 years we've had no arrests whatsoever. We had 2 the year before that, so it's been very successful in that regard. We haven't been able to secure any funding from the state and federal government to support us in that endeavour on an ongoing basis. So our community raises about $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and we don't get any support from state and federal governments to run an alcohol-free event, a family event on New Year's Eve. So I make the point more to emphasise that if you're going to be preaching to our young people about the need to, or the possibilities of enjoying yourself in an alcohol-free environment and without the temptation to binge drink, we need to actually put the money up to support the community groups and the sporting clubs I've mentioned before in their endeavours in that regard. I hasten to add that we have received occasional funding from the Victorian State Government after a major flood event. It was more of an economic stimulus that was provided for our town for a one-off, but we haven't been able to secure any ongoing funding for that type of activity. This is a complex issue. There are severe social and economic impacts which we're all aware of, but there's a huge human toll involved, and I urge the government to continue to pursue this very serious issue. But I just caution it's going to take a lot more than a tax grab, and I assure them the National Binge Drinking Strategy is a positive step, but I think much more needs to be done in relation to excessive drinking.